Flight 1047 had been airborne for 2 hours and 11 minutes when Avery Lawson heard it. Not an alarm, not a warning light, not a voice crackling through the intercom with careful, measured calm. Just a sound. A shift in engine pitch so slight that the man beside her didn't look up from his newspaper. The woman across the aisle kept sleeping, her neck bent at an angle that would hurt her later. A boy, 3 rows back, was laughing at something on his phone, headphones clamped over his ears, completely sealed from the world outside himself. Nobody heard it. Avery did. She was 34 years old, window seat 17. Somewhere over the high country of southern Idaho, and she had not sat in a cockpit in 6 years. She had not filed a flight plan in 6 years. She had not thought of herself as a pilot in 6 years, had actively worked to stop thinking of herself that way, had built an entire second life out of code and coffee and the deliberate daily practice of forgetting. But the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Her right hand was on the armrest. Her left hand was holding a small book. Leather cover brown, gone almost black at the corners, from years of handling the spine cracked and repaired with electrical tape that had since gone brittle. She had opened it to the same page she always opened it to on flights. The last page with any writing on it. She had read those 3 lines so many times she no longer needed to look. She knew them the way you know a prayer, the way you know your own name. But she wasn't reading them now. She was listening. The left engine. Something in the left engine was not right. The pitch had dropped a quarter tone, maybe less, in the space of about 4 seconds. Then it had come back. Then it had dropped again. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show yet on any instrument reading as a hard fault. It was the kind of variation that experienced ears noticed and inexperienced ears filed away as normal turbulence noise. Avery's ears were experienced. She set the small book carefully on her lap. She pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes and just listened. Counted, measured the interval between the variations. 8 seconds, 11 seconds, 7 seconds. The pattern wasn't consistent. That was the part that troubled her. Consistent variation meant atmospheric pressure, wind shear, something external. Inconsistent variation meant something internal, something mechanical. She opened her eyes and looked out the window. The left engine sat maybe 20 feet from her face, housed in its gray nacelle, beneath the wing, looking exactly as it always looked from a passenger seat, solid, industrial, indifferent. The sky beyond it was the particular blue that only existed at altitude, a blue so deep and clear it looked like a painting of the sky rather than the sky itself. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you're not sure how long they'll last. She looked back down at her hands. "Stop it," she told herself. "You are a passenger on a commercial aircraft, and you are going home, and you are not responsible for anything except keeping your tray table in the upright and locked position." The left engine dipped again. She exhaled slowly through her nose. 6 years of leaving it behind, and it turned out you couldn't leave it behind any more than you could leave behind the way you saw faces in crowds, or the way you automatically counted exits when you walked into a room. Some things don't leave you. They go underground and wait. She reached down and picked up the small leather book, held it with both hands, didn't open it. Her father had called it his logbook, though it wasn't a standard flight logbook in any official sense. It was a personal journal he had kept for nearly 20 years. A record of flights, yes, but also of weather, of observations, of small technical notes to himself, and occasionally of things that had nothing to do with flying at all. Her name appeared in it for the first time when she was 8 years old. He had written in his careful block print, "Avery rode along today on the Medford run. She wasn't scared of the turbulence. She looked out the window and asked me where the bumps came from. I told her the air had pockets in it, like the ground has valleys." She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "So the sky is a landscape, just invisible." I didn't know what to say to that. She's 8 years old. Avery remembered that day. The small prop plane, the smell of old upholstery and engine oil, the way the horizon tilted when her father banked left and she had grabbed the door handle without thinking. She remembered the sound of his voice, low and steady, explaining everything. The altimeter, the trim wheel, the way you read a headwind by the feel of the rudder pedals. His name was Raymond Lawson. He had flown for 21 years. Charter cargo, mostly small planes, small airstrips across the Pacific Northwest, the kind of flying that paid modestly and mattered enormously to the people who depended on it. He was not a decorated aviator. He was not the kind of pilot whose name anyone would know. He was just very, very good at the thing he loved, and he loved it so completely that it became the air inside the air, the thing underneath everything. He died on a Tuesday in November when Avery was 16. Not in a dramatic emergency, not in a storm or a mechanical failure of the kind that makes accident reports. He died because of ice on a runway in Bend, Oregon, on an early morning, and a brake that had been flagged for service and not yet serviced, in a moment of bad luck that didn't need to be more complicated than that. The plane didn't crash into anything. It skidded off the runway into a drainage ditch at low speed. The physics of it should have been survivable. They weren't. She had kept his logbook. Her mother had offered it to her the week after the funeral, holding it out without saying anything, and Avery had taken it without saying anything, and for 2 years it had sat in a shoebox in her closet. Then one day she had taken it out and started reading from the beginning, and she had read it all the way through, and when she was done, she had set it on her nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a long time. After that, it went with her on flights. Not every flight. She told herself that at first. Just this one, just once. But it became every flight became ritual without her ever consciously deciding to make it ritual, and she had stopped questioning it somewhere around the fourth or fifth year. She was thinking about her father when the man in seat 17B cleared his throat. She hadn't looked at him properly since she sat down. She'd been focused on getting settled, stowing her bag, finding her earbuds, doing the quiet procedural theater of preparing to be somewhere for 2.5 hours. She'd registered him in the peripheral way you register seatmates on commercial flights. Male, older suit, briefcase type. Filed him away as background. Now she looked, and she stopped breathing for approximately 2 seconds. The man was 60 years old, give or take. Silver hair close cropped and precise. A face that had been conventionally handsome once and had cured into something harder. Not ugly, but finished the way certain wood gets when it dries, denser, less forgiving. He wore a dark blazer over a light blue shirt, no tie. On the tray table in front of him was a newspaper folded open to the business section, and beside it a cup of coffee and a slim leather portfolio. He had not looked up. He was reading. Avery had not seen this man in 6 years. She had thought about him more times than she would ever admit to anyone. His name was Colonel Frank Sutter. Until his retirement 14 months ago, he had served as senior evaluator for advanced flight programs at Maxwell Air Force Base, a position that gave him the authority to determine which candidates advanced and which did not. He had exercised that authority in Avery's case with a single paragraph written in the precise, effectless language of institutional decision-making. She had memorized that paragraph. She had not wanted to memorize it, but she had read it enough times that it had become part of her internal architecture, whether she wanted it or not. Candidate demonstrates strong technical aptitude and above-average simulator performance. However, evaluation panel has concerns regarding candidate's psychological profile in high-stakes scenarios. Candidate shows patterns of emotional overinvestment in outcomes consistent with documented dependency on deceased parents' aviation legacy. Recommendation, non-advancement. Candidate is not suited for high-pressure command situations. Not suited for high-pressure command situations. She was 28 years old when she read those words. She had been flying since she was 17. She had logged more simulator hours than anyone else in her cohort. Her instructors, not Sutter, other people, had told her she had the best hands they'd seen in years. It hadn't mattered. Sutter's panel had the final word, and Sutter's panel had used her grief over her dead father as evidence that she lacked the psychological stability for command. She had appealed. The appeal had been denied. She had left Maxwell 2 weeks later and had spent the following 6 years building a career in software development because software did not require her to be near an airplane. And near an airplane was somewhere she had decided she could not be. Except she still flew. Twice a month out of Hillsborough Regional, a Cessna 172, no passengers, no destination, just her and 800 feet of runway and the particular silence that existed at altitude. She had kept her CFOI certification current. Not out of hope, she told herself, just out of habit. 847 hours logged. She flew because she couldn't stop the same way certain people can't stop reading. Not because they expected to lead anywhere, just because the stopping would cost too much. Sutter had not looked up. He did not know she was there. She turned back to the window. The left engine was doing it again. That fractional dip, that hesitation in the otherwise seamless roar of the turbofan at cruise. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cold window glass. Counted. 8 seconds, then 12, then 8 again. She needed to calm down. She was imagining things. She was a software engineer in seat 17A who had not flown a commercial aircraft in her life, and she was not going to start diagnosing one from a passenger seat based on a sound no trained mechanic had flagged and no crew member had mentioned. She put her earbuds in, selected something without words, turned the volume up to the point where conversation would have been impossible. The music lasted 4 minutes before she took the earbuds out again. The engine variation was still there, slightly more pronounced now. Still within the range of plausible deniability. Still the kind of thing you could explain away if explaining away was what you needed to do. But Avery had grown up learning to read the invisible landscape of the air, and what she was reading right now sent a slow, cold thread of certainty down the length of her spine. Something was wrong with the left engine. She set the in-flight magazine on her lap and opened it and looked at the words without reading them. Because there was nothing to be done at this moment. Because she was a passenger. Because she was almost certainly wrong. Because even if she were right, there was an entire train crew aboard whose job was to notice these things before passengers did. She was on page 37 of an article about Pacific Northwest restaurants when the flight attendant walked past with the drinks cart. Avery had not ordered anything, but she watched the woman move. Her posture, the direction of her eyes, the precise efficiency of her gestures. Flight attendants developed a professional stillness that masked everything below it. This one was not fully still. There was a tightness in her jaw, a micro-compression around her eyes. She looked very briefly toward the front of the aircraft. Then she looked away and smiled at the next passenger and poured his coffee with an unwavering hand. Avery noted this, filed it. Beside her, Sutter had put down the newspaper and was opening the leather portfolio. Avery couldn't help seeing the top sheet. She wasn't trying to read it. It was simply there in her field of vision, and her eyes were the kind of eyes that processed information quickly and without much asking. The header read FAA, Office of Safety Assurance, Internal Correspondence, Confidential. Below that in smaller text, Re-Maintenance Deviation Authorization, Pacific Regional Fleet, Batch Reference PR-1047, PR-1047. She looked away, looked back. The number could mean anything. Fleet reference codes use sequential numbering. PR-1047 did not necessarily refer to Flight 1047. It was a coincidence, a reasonable coincidence. She stared at the engine through the window. PR-1047. Sutter closed the portfolio before she could read further. He picked up his coffee and looked out his own window, and for a moment Avery could see his profile. The line of his jaw, the set of his eyes. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief, not exactly anger. Something older and colder than either of those. The particular weight of having been judged and found wanting by someone who never actually knew you. She looked down at the logbook. Trust the trim her father had written in the last entry. Let the plane find its angle. Those were the last words he ever wrote. He had set the pen down and gone out to the runway, and she had not seen him alive again. She had spent years trying to understand what he meant, not the technical meaning. She knew the technical meaning, the mechanical adjustment of control surfaces to achieve balance without constant manual input. She meant the larger meaning, the one that felt like it was aimed at her, even though he had written it 6 hours before she would ever read it, 6 hours before he was gone, and she was 16, and the world had gone quiet in a particular way it never entirely came back from. The engine ran smooth for 4 minutes. Then the flight attendant, the one with the compressed jaw, walked quickly past them toward the front of the cabin without making eye contact with anyone. She moved with the specific purposefulness of someone who does not want to be stopped. 3 rows back, a teenage boy sat with a worn notebook open on his tray table. He was not watching a screen. He was drawing. Precise, careful drawings of mechanical things, the kind made by someone who understood how things were built and found the structure of them beautiful. A landing gear assembly rendered with real technical understanding, the components labeled in small, neat handwriting. He looked 17, maybe younger. He was flying alone, no one beside him, no one he'd spoken to since boarding. He had the particular stillness of a kid who had been through something significant recently and hadn't finished processing it yet. The kind of stillness that looks like calm, but is actually a controlled retreat from a world that had recently stopped being safe. Avery recognized that kind of stillness. She had worn it herself at 16. The intercom clicked. The captain's voice came through, smooth, professional, the voice of a man who had done this thousands of times. He announced that they were passing over northern Oregon, that the weather in Seattle was clear, that local time on arrival would be 10:47 in the morning. His name, according to the screen at the front of the cabin, was Captain G. Harmon. Avery noticed something in his delivery, not hesitation exactly, a deliberateness in the pacing that was one beat slower than the words required. A man choosing each word with slightly more care than it needed. Someone managing something beneath the surface of the surface. She might have been imagining it. She looked at her father's logbook, then at the document in Sutter's portfolio, now closed on his tray table, 2 feet from her left hand, then at the engine. She thought about what an FAA Safety Review Board member would have the authority to sign. She knew the maintenance wherever process well, had studied aviation safety protocols at Maxwell, understood the chain of authorization required for a commercial aircraft to continue service under a pending maintenance flag. Someone had to sign off. Someone with rank and clearance sufficient to override a standard grounding recommendation. She thought about what it would mean if that document in Sutter's portfolio was a maintenance waiver for this aircraft, for this engine. She thought about the fact that Sutter was now on the FAA Safety Review Board. She had read that in an industry newsletter 8 months ago, had read it and felt nothing she was prepared to name, and had closed the browser tab and made herself a cup of coffee. She was speculating. She knew she was speculating. But her father had told her this when she was 19, standing in front of a weather chart at the small airport in Medford on a cloudy afternoon. Good pilots pay attention to the full picture. They don't dismiss signals because the signals are inconvenient or uncertain. The plane is always trying to tell you something. Your job is to learn how to listen. The engine ran smooth for another 4 minutes. Then Sutter shifted in his seat and the portfolio slid and the top sheet came loose and fell onto the shared armrest between them, and before he could gather it back, Avery saw the full header. FAA, Office of Safety Assurance. Internal correspondence. Confidential. Remaintenance deviation authorization. Fleet Unit N7-1047, left engine compressor stage inspection override. Authorization signatory, Colonel F. Sutter, FAA Safety Review Board. Date of authorization 87 days prior to current date. Status pending closure. Seattle Field Office. She read it in approximately 2 seconds. Sutter reached over and gathered the page back into his portfolio with a quick, unbothered gesture. He glanced at her. The casual, slightly territorial look of a man who assumed whatever he did was private by default. He did not recognize her. He had not recognized her when they'd settled into their seats. He had not recognized her now. 6 years was a long time, and he had evaluated hundreds of candidates, and she had been 28 then and was 34 now. And people like Frank Sutter did not tend to retain detailed memories of the people they had turned away. The people they turned away remembered them. The process did not run in reverse. Avery looked out the window. N7-1047. The aircraft's fleet unit designation. Left engine compressor, stage inspection override, signed by Sutter 87 days ago. Pending closure in Seattle, which meant the safety file was still open, which meant someone in the Seattle field office was still asking questions, which meant Sutter was flying there with documents in hand to answer those questions before anyone else could shape the narrative. The compressor stage. She knew exactly what a compromised left engine compressor sounded like under cruise load. She had studied the failure profiles. She had run the simulations. It was one of the more insidious failure modes because the degradation was gradual and the audio signature was subtle. A variation in pitch, not in volume, the kind of thing that didn't show clearly on standard instrument readouts until the degradation crossed a threshold. She had been hearing that sound for 2 hours. The man sitting beside her had signed a document allowing this aircraft to continue flying with a known compressor issue. He was on this aircraft right now. He was carrying the paperwork he needed to close the safety file before anyone could examine the history of his decision. And the engine was failing, not catastrophically, not yet, but failing. She thought about her father, about a brake that had been flagged for service and not yet serviced, about a moment of bad luck on an icy runway in November. She thought about the people on this aircraft, the couple across the aisle. The elderly man 3 rows back who had fallen asleep with his mouth slightly open and his reading glasses still on. The boy in seat 23 drawing landing gear assemblies in a worn notebook because he was 17 years old and alone and had recently lost his mother and didn't know what else to do with his hands. She thought about what it meant that she was the only person on this plane who could hear what the engine was saying. Then the sound changed. Not the quarter tone variation she'd been tracking. Not the subtle drift she'd cataloged and measured and rationalized for 2 hours. Something different. A roughness underneath the roar. Something grinding at a frequency that didn't belong there, climbing fast. Avery's hand closed around the logbook. The engine gave one long, shuddering protest. She felt it through the fuselage, through the seat, through the armrest, and into the bone beneath her skin. Then everything happened at once. The aircraft pitched left. The overhead bins rattled. Someone behind her cried out a short, sharp sound, surprise more than panic, the sound you make before you understand what you're reacting to. Then the bang, not enormous, not movie loud, a contained percussive report from somewhere under the left wing, and then a drop the floor falling slightly, the stomach going, slightly, the unambiguous physical message of an aircraft losing lift on one side. The intercom clicked on instantly. Captain Harmon's voice, still controlled, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. A density, a weight. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We are experiencing a mechanical situation and the crew is handling it. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions. The emergency lights came on, soft yellow along the aisle. The flight attendants moved efficiently quickly without running their training, holding them in a posture that said everything is being managed, even as Avery could see in the face of the nearest one that everything was not fully being managed yet, that there was a window of minutes in which the situation was still either recoverable or not, and no one in the cabin yet knew which side of that line they were on. Sutter had gripped the armrest between them, his knuckles pale. His face the particular color of a man who understands in a sudden physical way the full consequence of a decision he made 87 days ago in an office where the stakes had been numbers on a page. Avery looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at the flight attendant moving past her row. She reached out and touched the woman's arm. Firm, not urgent, the practiced contact of someone accustomed to communicating precision without panic. The attendant stopped, met her eyes. Avery spoke quietly, clearly, and without any of the things that would make her easy to dismiss. No fear in her voice. No performance. No plea. My name is Avery Lawson. I am a certified flight instructor with 847 hours logged current credentials. I flew Air Force advanced programs for 3 years before private aviation. I need you to listen to me carefully because I have been monitoring the left engine since we passed over Idaho, and I can tell you exactly what is happening to this aircraft, and I need to know what your crew needs from this cabin. The attendant stared at her. In the seat beside Avery, Frank Sutter turned his head. For the first time in 6 years, he looked at her face, and he went very still. Avery did not look back at him. She kept her eyes on the flight attendant. Her left hand was in her lap. Her right hand held her father's logbook, and her thumb was pressed against the cracked spine of it, and she was not squeezing it or shaking or in any way performing the internal experience of a person whose heart was moving at approximately twice its resting rate. The aircraft leveled slightly, then dropped again. The left engine was audibly uneven now. No more subtlety, no more subtext. Just a mechanical system in real distress, communicating its condition in the oldest language available to it. The boy 3 rows back had stopped drawing. He was looking out the window at the left wing with an expression Avery recognized immediately. Not fear, not resignation, but a kind of intense, focused attention. The expression of someone who wants to understand what is happening to them, even if what is happening is the worst possible thing. She understood that expression completely. She had worn it herself, at 16, at 28, and now at 34 in seat 17, a somewhere over Oregon with a failing engine on her left and a man whose signature had failed it on her right. The flight attendant made a decision with her eyes. She leaned in and said very quietly, "Stay in your seat. I'm going to the cockpit." Then she was gone, moving forward through the tilting yellow-lit cabin, and Avery sat back and breathed once slowly and completely the way her father had taught her. Fill the bottom of the lungs first, then the middle, then the top. Let it out in reverse. And in the time it takes to do that, you can find the thing inside you that knows what to do next. She found it. It was still there. It had always been there. The left engine groaned, and the aircraft pitched again, and somewhere behind her a child began to cry, and Avery Lawson sat in the seat 17A with her father's logbook in her hand and waited to be called forward. The cockpit smelled like burnt wiring and cold sweat, and the particular staleness of recycled air breathed under pressure for too long. Avery took it in through one breath as she crossed the threshold. She did not pause. She did not look back. She moved directly to the right-hand seat and put her hands on the edge of the instrument panel and looked at the board the way her father had taught her to look at anything unfamiliar and technical. Wide first, then narrow. Get the whole picture before you focus on any single part of it. The whole picture was not good. Red indicators across the left engine panel, hydraulic pressure showing degraded but not failed to 62 on the gauge when full operation read 100. Autopilot disengaged the small amber light blinking with the patient persistence of a system that had been told to stop and was politely confirming it had stopped. The navigation display flickering at the edges, the moving map stuttering between rendering and gray blankness, GPS feed losing coherence. Altitude holding for now, airspeed within range. Heading drifting 2 degrees north of where it should be, nobody correcting it. The aircraft beginning the slow, almost imperceptible lean of an unattended machine. And in the left seat, Captain Gareth Harmon. She had expected the co-pilot to be the problem. The attendant had said the co-pilot was unresponsive. What she had not said, or perhaps had not known, or perhaps had not had time to say was that Harmon was also failing. He was 58 years old. He looked older than that now. He was gripping the yoke with both hands, which was the right thing to do mechanically, but his grip was wrong. The tension in his forearms was asymmetric, his right side doing most of the work, his left side compensating recruiting muscles from elsewhere, the body routing around something that wasn't functioning inside it. His face was the color of old concrete. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his uniform shirt and was tracking down his temple in a thin, steady line. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth in measured intervals that Avery recognized immediately as the breathing of a person managing pain. Not a person at rest, a person holding something back. He looked at her when she came in. His eyes were clear. Whatever was happening in his chest had not touched his eyes. They were the gray-green of shallow ocean water, and they were steady, and they were unmistakably relieved. He said, "You're the one from 17A. She said, "Yes." He said, "Credentials." She said, "Air Force Advanced Program 3 years. CFI current, 847 hours logged. I flew a Cessna out of Hillsborough 10 days ago." He absorbed this in approximately 1 second. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat in the right-hand seat and put both hands on the edge of the panel and gave herself exactly 3 seconds to take in the full scope of the difference between this and anything she had trained on. The Boeing systems, the scale of the avionics, the weight and complexity of everything. She acknowledged the gap. She let it register. Then she moved past it because 3 seconds was what she could afford, and what she could not afford was to let that gap become a reason for paralysis. She said, "Tell me everything." Fast. Harmon told her fast. Left engine compressor failure confirmed. Engine shut down per emergency protocol 2 minutes ago. Right engine running but showing elevated temperature, not yet critical margin, narrowing at approximately 2 degrees every 4 minutes. Hydraulic systems at 62%, enough for primary flight controls, insufficient for flap extension. Autopilot disengaged at engine failure and not re-engaged because Harmon didn't have enough hands and enough capacity to manage both the aircraft and the re-engagement sequence simultaneously. A TC contact intermittent. For the last 4 minutes, a known vulnerability to electrical interference from certain hydraulic failure modes. They had gotten one partial transmission through enough to declare emergency, not enough to confirm the transmission had been received. Danny Marsh was in the first officer's seat with his oxygen mask on and his eyes closed. He had lost consciousness approximately 6 minutes ago when the cabin pressure briefly fluctuated during the initial compressor failure. Pulse present, breathing shallow but steady. He would not be useful to them in the next 30 minutes. And then Harmon himself. Avery looked at him directly and asked, because there was no version of this where the question was optional. She said, "What's happening with you?" He didn't look away. He said, "Chest, left side. Started 2 hours before takeoff. I thought it was reflux. Then I thought it wasn't reflux. Then we were already in the air." She said, "How bad is it right now?" He said, "Manageable. For a while longer. But I can't do fine motor corrections. My left hand is not reliable." She said, "Then I have the aircraft." She put both hands on the yoke. It pushed back against her stiff and heavy and honest. The hydraulic assist degraded just enough to make itself felt in every input. She felt the drift in heading through her palms. She felt the slight, nose-heavy pitch that came from the asymmetric thrust of a single engine. She began correcting in small increments, building a picture through her hands of what the aircraft needed, the way you learn anything real, not by being told, but by listening. She said, "I have the aircraft." Harmon said, "You have the aircraft." He released the yoke. His hands came back to his lap. In 30 years of flying, he had never done that. The specific, formal, irreversible act of a captain surrendering his machine to someone else's hands. His face showed the weight of it. Not reluctance, not defeat, but something more complex than either, the expression of a man who has reached the far boundary of what his own body will allow and has found at that boundary someone ready to take the next step. She said, "What do you need from me right now?" He said, "Land this aircraft." She said, "I will. First, give me position and terrain." He pulled up the navigation display on the backup system, the one that wasn't stuttering. It resolved clean. They were over the high country of northern Oregon, moving northwest. Below them, the Cascade Range volcanic peaks and dense old-growth forest and river valleys, and nothing flat enough or long enough to put a commercial aircraft down safely. Seattle was 61 miles ahead. Portland was 43 miles behind. She ran the calculation in her head in the time it took him to say, "We can't make either of them." She knew he was right. On one engine at degraded power with hydraulics compromised and flaps unavailable, attempting a major airport meant a controlled descent over populated terrain with no guarantee of reaching the runway before the right engine crossed its thermal limit. It was a bet she might win. She wasn't looking to bet. She was looking for something better than a bet. She said, "Is there an offline terrain database on the backup tablet?" Harmon reached to the secondary panel and handed her a tablet. She held it in her left hand and flew with her right and scrolled the terrain data with her thumb. She had practiced this in simulation, finding emergency landing options from terrain data when primary navigation was compromised. She had been good at it. She needed to be good at it right now. She found it in 40 seconds. Mackenzie Ridge, 44 miles northeast of current position. Former Air Force logistics strip, Cold War era, decommissioned in 1987. Concrete surface. Original length 3,100 feet. Elevation 4,200 above sea level. No current operational status. No instrument approach. No lighting systems on record. She ran the numbers. Glide ratio for this aircraft in current configuration. Distance, altitude. Wind from the northwest at 16 knots, which meant a headwind on approach, which meant shorter landing distance required, which meant the math got marginally better. Marginally better was what they had. She said Mackenzie Ridge, former military strip, northeast 44 miles. Harmon was quiet for a moment. He knew exactly what she was proposing. A decommissioned airstrip on no current chart, no instrument, guidance, no emergency services in place on one engine, with degraded hydraulics, no flaps. He said, "I flew out of that strip in 1991. It was rough then." She said, "It exists." He looked at her. Then he said, "Yes, it exists." She handed him the tablet. He tapped in the coordinates and the backup GPS resolved the track, and she looked at it and banked the aircraft gently right, bringing the nose around to the new heading. The right engine protested the increased load through the turn, and the temperature gauge climbed 2 degrees. She came back to level heading, and the engine settled by 1 degree. She keyed the secondary radio transmitter. Not a voice call, the antenna was still unreliable for voice. Just coordinates and emergency code repeated twice timed to coincide with the moments when the interference was lowest. Whether it got through, she didn't know. She had to proceed as though it had. Then the intercom buzzed. Harmon answered. His face changed. He looked at Avery and said, "There's someone at the door. He says he's a pilot. He says he wants to help." Avery did not take her eyes off the forward display. She said, "What's his name?" Harmon relayed the question and listened. Then Sutter. Colonel Frank Sutter, retired. He says he has a commercial rating and 500 hours. The right engine temperature ticked up another degree. Avery thought about Frank Sutter standing on the other side of the cockpit door with his leather portfolio and his 500 hours and his 87-day-old signature on a document that was the reason they were having this conversation. She thought about what it would mean to open that door and let him in. She thought about it for exactly the amount of time the situation could afford, which was not long. She said, "Lock the door." Harmon looked at her. She said it again the same way she had said, "I have the aircraft," not louder, just more completely. The words of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. He reached over and engaged the cockpit door lock. A soft, solid click. The sound of a system working exactly as designed. The intercom buzzed again. Harmon switched it off. She said, "When this is over, that man has paperwork on him that the FAA is going to want to see. His portfolio." He was on his way to Seattle to close a safety file on this aircraft's left engine compressor. He is the authorization signatory on the maintenance waiver that allowed this aircraft to fly today. Harmon was very still. He said, "You're certain of that?" She said, "I read the header. Fleet Unit N7-1047, left engine compressor inspection override." His name on the signature line. Harmon was quiet for a long time, long enough that she looked at him. He said, "In 30 years of flying, I have never." She said, "I know. We land this aircraft and then that becomes someone else's problem. Right now, it's yours and mine. What do you need me to know about the right engine before it tells me itself?" He straightened in his seat as much as the pain allowed. Something in his bearing reorganized, settled, committed to the work in front of him, the way pilots commit when the deciding is over and the doing has begun. He said, "The thermal limit is marked at red. If it crosses red, I'll call it immediately. You have maybe 15 minutes of margin at current power setting before we start gambling." She said, "Talk me through the flap system limitations." "I know the theory, I need your experience. What does this aircraft do without flaps on a short runway?" He started talking, low, precise, the 30 years of it audible in every word. She absorbed what he said, and she flew, making constant small corrections, trimming the aircraft into a configuration that minimized drag given the missing flaps. Not what any approach checklist would specify, the result of understanding the physics rather than the procedure designed for normal situations. In the cabin, the flight attendants had moved through every row. People were in the brace position, those who could manage it. Some hadn't been able to fold themselves forward and had instead sat upright, watching the trees rush closer through the windows, the terrain below, resolving from the abstract geography of high altitude into individual ridgelines and river cuts in the dark mass of old-growth forest. The cabin had gone quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people who had stopped pretending. No one scrolled a phone, no one adjusted a pillow. They sat inside what was happening and waited for it to resolve into one of two things. In seat 23C, Tyler Reeves had his notebook open on his tray table. He was not drawing. He was sitting with the pen in his hand and his eyes fixed on the window watching the terrain below, with the focused attention of someone who understood from months of self-directed study more about what he was seeing than most of the adults around him. They were lower than they should have been. The remaining engines sounded different from before. He knew what these things meant even without anyone telling him. He had lost his mother 43 days ago. He was going to Seattle to live with his father, whom he had not lived with since he was 9. He had packed the notebook because drawing mechanical things was the one activity that required enough concentration to keep his thoughts from going places he did not want them to go. He put the pen to paper. He began drawing what he could see through the window, the ridge line, the mountains, the narrow, pale rectangle of something in the valley below that looked like concrete, looked like a runway, looked like where they were going. He drew because it was the thing he knew how to do. 20 miles out, Avery picked up Mackenzie Ridge on the terrain display. The GPS track was holding. The right engine temperature sat 2 degrees below red, not improving, not worsening, sitting at its limit, the way a pressure system sits before it either breaks or turns. She said, "Talk me through the north approach. You said it was better." Harmon said north end. The south approach had a steeper gradient and a crosswind tendency from the ridge above it. We always came in from the north if we had the choice. She said wind is northwest today. Left crosswind on a north approach. He said yes, manageable with flaps, less manageable without. She said I know, surface condition in 1991. He said cracked concrete, not broken. Vegetation incursions on the east side, but the center line was clear. I don't know what 35 more years of abandonment does to that. She said we'll find out. Then she saw it. Not the airstrip yet, the terrain around it. The specific way the land flattened in the valley between ridges where an old military installation would logically have been built. She was reading the landscape the way she had learned to read it as a teenager, understanding topography not as an abstraction on a chart, but as a physical reality that had to be respected and not wished away. She said, I have the valley. Call the strip when you see it. Harmon leaned forward against the pane and looked out, and after 10 seconds said, 11 o'clock, down low, the break in the trees. She saw it, and then she saw the rest of it. The airstrip was there. The concrete had survived 35 years of abandonment in a way that spoke to the original quality of the military construction. It was real, and it was within their glide path, and the sight of it produced in her chest something she didn't have time to name. But approximately 1/3 of the far end was gone. Not destroyed, consumed. The forest had done what forests do when human maintenance stops moving in slowly without announcement, and the trees that had been saplings in 1987 were now 40-foot conifers standing dense and uncompromising across the last 900 feet of the runway's design length. The usable surface was perhaps 2,200 feet. For a commercial aircraft without flaps coming in on one overheating engine in a crosswind, the math had changed. Harmon said, I see it. She said, I see it. He said, it's possible. She said, it has to be more than possible. He said, I know. She reached for the landing gear lever, engaged it, heard the hydraulic system labor, heard the thunk and groan of the gear beginning to drop. She watched the indicator panel. 2 green lights appeared. Then a third position sat dark. Not red, which would mean confirmed failure. Not green, just dark. A system neither confirming success nor declaring failure, sitting in the ambiguity that was in some ways harder to manage than either. She cycled the manual override, held it, released, checked the indicator. Still dark. Cycled it again. Still dark. She ran the checklist sequence for indicator circuit reset from memory, working through the electrical sequence with a precision that came not from having done it before, but from having studied it until it lived in the same place as everything else she knew about flight. The indicator stayed dark. She had 2 minutes before she needed to commit to the approach. She used them the way her father had taught her to use the seconds before a hard decision. Not to rehearse outcomes, not to negotiate with what she was afraid of, but to settle the hands. to let the noise fall away until only the problem remained, and the problem was specific and physical and had a solution or it didn't, and either way, her hands were on the yoke. She reached to the instrument panel ledge and picked up the logbook, opened it to the last page. Her father's handwriting, precise and faintly slanted, the pen pressure, heavier than usual, as though he had been pressing down with more conviction than normal on that particular morning. Wind from the northwest. Trust the trim, let the plane find its angle. She closed it, set it back on the ledge. She looked at Harmon. He was watching her with the full attention of a man who has run out of options and has found in that running out a strange and complete peace. She said, "I'm going to fly a shallower approach than standard. Come in slow and high over the tree line, steepen only at the threshold. It puts us on the numbers faster than the glide path allows, but it keeps the nose up longer on the rollout. If the gear is down and locked, we gain nothing. If it isn't, we gain a few extra seconds before the nose touches, and a few extra seconds is not nothing." Harmon said, "And the speed." She said, "We'll be fast. We can't be anything but fast without flaps. The headwind buys some of it back. I need you to call altitude and speed. I can't watch both at once." He said, "I've got altitude and speed." She said, "When we clear the tree line, I need the runway numbers in my sight within 3 seconds." He said, "There's no go-around, not enough left in that engine." She said, "I know. That's why I need the numbers in 3 seconds." He almost smiled. Not humor, something older than humor. The expression of a man recognizing something he respects in a situation long past the point of comfortable feelings about anything. He said, "You were Air Force." She said, "Yes." He said, "Who washed you out?" She said, "It doesn't matter right now." He said, "No. I suppose it doesn't." She pushed the nose down fractionally and began the final descent toward the valley. The right engine hit redline temperature in the last mile, and she reduced thrust by 3%, and the airspeed dropped, and the rate of descent increased, and she corrected, and the engine settled back by 1 degree, and she held it there on the edge of everything the aircraft had left to give. 3 miles, the tree line came up in her field of vision, the tops of the 40-foot conifers forming a wall between the open air and the cracked concrete beyond it. Harmon said 700 feet, 162 knots. She said, "I need 158. She reduced thrust and felt the speed bleed away, and the descent angle steepen, and she brought the nose up a fraction to compensate and found the balance point. 500 feet. Harmon said 158. Holding. She held it there. 400 feet. The trees directly ahead, the runway, threshold invisible behind them. Everything committed now. No version of this that didn't end on the ground one way or another. Harmon said 300. The treetops were beneath her, and then behind her. And the threshold was there, the white painted numbers visible for exactly the 3 seconds she had asked for, and she felt the ground effect beginning that cushion of compressed air between the descending wing and the approaching surface, and she held the nose up and waited. Harmon said 50 feet. She pulled the thrust back to idle. The right engine went quiet, not gradually, all at once. It had given everything it had, and had now given the last of it. The thermal limit finally crossed in these final seconds, the machine releasing itself from the effort with the finality of something that has completed its purpose. They were on glide only, gravity and momentum, and the shape of the wings, and whatever Avery's hands could ask of the controls. 20 feet. She held the nose. 1 degree up. Hold it, hold it. She said very quietly to no one in particular, "Let the plane find its angle." The main gear touched, not gently, not roughly, with the firm, decisive certainty of something that was supposed to happen and had happened. The left and right main gear meeting the concrete simultaneously, the aircraft's weight transferring from air to ground in the way it was designed to transfer. The suspension absorbed the load. The tires began their work. The nose came down slowly. The shallow approach angle paying its dividend in these last seconds, the nose descending as though the aircraft was setting it down deliberately with intention, and when the nose gear made contact, it made contact with both wheels, which meant it had been down and locked the entire time, and the indicator had been the circuit and not the gear. She was on the runway. She applied brakes immediately manually, the full available pressure through the degraded hydraulics. The aircraft shuddered. The tires screamed against the concrete. She kept the pressure on the brakes and held the nose straight with the rudder pedals as the aircraft tracked down the center line, and the far tree line rushed toward them with the speed of something that had not been consulted about any of this. Harmon said, "Come on." She did not speak. The aircraft slowed. It slowed with the resistance of its own mass working against the brakes, against the rolling friction of the concrete, against the headwind that was now a help instead of a complication. It slowed, and the trees came and came, and she held the brakes to the floor and asked the aircraft for everything it had left. It stopped. The nose of the aircraft was 41 feet from the tree line. She knew that number later. At the moment it stopped, she knew only that it had stopped, that the concrete was solid beneath her, that the aircraft was not moving, that every system that had been managing its own failure for the last 40 minutes had now released itself from the effort, all at once like a crowd sitting down. She became aware that her hands were still on the yoke, that she had not released it, that her grip was the same grip she had established when she first took control, and she had to consciously instruct her fingers to open one at a time the way you open a hand that has been holding something for a very long time. She looked at her father's logbook, still on the ledge of the instrument panel where she had set it. She looked at Harmon. He was looking at her. The pain was still in his face, the pallor and the sweat, and he would need to be off this aircraft and in a hospital within the hour. But his eyes were what they had been from the beginning, clear, steady, and now something else. Something she recognized because she had seen it in her father's face long ago, in the moments after a hard approach resolved into a safe landing. He said, "I've flown for 30 years. He said, "I've never seen that." She said nothing. He said, "Who washed you out?" She looked at the logbook. She said, "A man who measured the wrong things." Outside, through the forward windows of the cockpit, the valley was still and bright. The forest stood to the south with its wall of silence. The concrete of the runway stretched behind them, marked with the long, dark tracks of tire rubber, the scorched evidence of everything they had asked the aircraft to do and everything it had done. Somewhere through the heavy fuselage, muffled and growing, she could hear it beginning. Voices, movement, the first sounds of people realizing they were alive. She said, "Get whatever radio we have left onto emergency services. Then we get those doors open." He said, "Yes." She sat for one more second with her hands in her lap and the logbook in front of her, and the sound of the survivors coming through the walls around her like light through the first crack in something that had been sealed for a very long time. Then she stood up. The first sound she heard when she opened the cockpit door was a child asking a question. Not crying, not screaming, just a small voice somewhere in the middle of the cabin, asking with the guileless precision that children bring to moments adults find too large for language. "Are we on the ground now? Are we really on the ground?" And from the seat beside that voice, a woman answering, "Yes, yes, baby, we're on the ground." Avery stood in the cockpit doorway for 3 seconds and listened to that exchange and let it be what it was. Then she stepped through. The cabin had the specific quality of aftermath, not chaos. The chaos had passed somewhere in the final minutes of the descent when the brace position and the proximity of the trees through the windows had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left people with only the bare facts of their own existence. What remained was quieter and stranger than chaos. People sitting upright or bent forward with their faces in their hands. People holding the people nearest to them with the completeness of grip that had nothing to do with social convention. Some crying without sound. Some talking in low, rapid voices to no one in particular. Some doing nothing at all, just sitting in the yellow emergency light with their eyes open, taking inventory of themselves. The flight attendants were moving, all of them, efficient, impale, and held together by the disciplined competence of people who understood that their own fear was not currently relevant to the task in front of them. One of them saw Avery emerge from the cockpit, and her face did something complicated that Avery understood completely and did not have time for right now. Avery walked down the aisle, not running, not above the ordinary conversational pace. She moved with the measured step of someone who understood that panic at this stage was not only an internal experience, but a contagion, and the best prevention was the simplest possible evidence through posture, through pace, through expression, that the situation was now categorically different from what it had been. She looked at each person she passed, not performed attention, real attention, 1 or 2 seconds each. The couple from across the aisle, the woman gripping her husband's forearm with both hands. The elderly man who had been clutching his chest during the descent and who now leaned against the window with the exhausted relief of someone who had bargained hard for something and received it. The mother with 2 small children who had spent the final minutes with her arms wrapped around both of them and who now had her cheek resting on top of the smaller one's head and looked at Avery with an expression that was beyond words and didn't require them. Avery nodded to each of them. 1 row before seat 23C, she stopped. Tyler Reeves had not moved from the brace position. Still bent forward, forearms on the seat back in front of him, forehead resting on his forearms, notebook closed on the tray table. His shoulders moved in the controlled rhythm of deliberate breathing, the careful in and out of someone whose body had told them to stay very still and who had listened. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He looked up. His eyes were dry, red at the edges but dry. He was 17 years old and he had just survived something most people never experience. And his face had the stunned, clarified quality of a person who has been very close to an edge and has stepped back from it and is still standing at the place where the two territories meet. Not yet fully in either one. She said, "You did well." He blinked. He looked like he wanted to say something but hadn't yet found what it was. She said, "The notebook. Keep drawing." Then she kept walking. She passed seat 17B. Frank Sutter was sitting upright, hands flat on his thighs, leather portfolio in his lap. He had not stowed it in the overhead bin when the emergency began. He had kept it with him through the descent, through the brace, through the landing, which told her something she had already suspected about the nature of his relationship to its contents. He looked at her as she passed. She had expected in the abstract way she had imagined this moment during the descent without fully inhabiting the imagination of it that she would feel something large when she passed him. Anger or satisfaction or some version of vindication rising in her chest like a pressure system finally resolving. She had expected that the proximity of him, after what she had just done, would carry an emotional charge that needed managing. It didn't. She looked at him for the same 1 or 2 seconds she had given everyone else. What she felt was not complex. It was very simple. The feeling of a person who has finished a task and found the task complete. He said nothing. For the first time in her experience of Frank Sutter, he had nothing to say. She kept walking. At the rear of the aircraft, the emergency exits were already being prepared. She joined the flight attendants and helped guide the last rows toward the slides, the process orderly in the way emergency processes become orderly when the people managing them have nothing left to spend on anything other than the work itself. Passengers went down the slides one at a time. Some stopped at the bottom and turned back to look at the aircraft as though they needed to verify it was really there, really stopped. One man knelt on the concrete when he reached the ground and pressed both palms flat against it. She understood that completely. When the last passenger was off, she stood at the rear door and looked the length of the empty cabin. Oxygen masks hanging loose from the ceiling in irregular clusters. Overhead bins open, luggage shifted by the rough landing. The yellow emergency lights still casting everything in the color of old photographs. She stepped off the aircraft. The air was cold and thin and smelled of pine and aviation fuel and the sharp, clean scent of the Cascade High Country in late morning. The sky above the valley was completely indifferent to what had occurred beneath it, which seemed right to her. Emergency vehicles were arriving from the south end of the valley. A fire truck first moving fast across the uneven concrete, followed by 2 ambulances and a line of civilian vehicles pressed into service. Pickup trucks, a county sheriff's SUV, a utility van with a local search and rescue logo on the door. Someone had received the position ping. Someone had acted on it quickly and well. Harmon was taken off the aircraft on a stretcher. He was conscious and arguing with the paramedics about the stretcher, which she took as a reasonable sign. She watched them load him into the first ambulance, and she caught his eye as the doors began to close, and he looked at her with the gray-green eyes and gave her one deliberate nod. The nod of a man who has transferred something of value and knows the transfer was received. People came to her after that. Paramedics first, who she told she was uninjured, and pointed immediately toward Danny Marsh, still unconscious in the cockpit. Emergency coordinators who needed the situation summarized. A sheriff's deputy who needed her name and credentials for his initial report. She gave each person what they needed in the order they needed it and did not perform any of the things the situation might have invited her to perform. She stood on the cracked Cold War concrete of Mackenzie Ridge in the November mountain air, and she did what she had always done in the space after a flight resolved. She took stock. The aircraft was down. 181 people were alive. Harmon was hurt but stable. Marsh was unconscious but breathing. The gear had been down the entire time. The nose had not touched. She looked back at the aircraft once. Standing there in its improbable stillness on the repurposed military concrete, the tire marks running the length of the usable surface, long dark streaks telling the story of the deceleration in the language of physics, plain and unarguable. Then she pressed her father's logbook against her chest with both hands and held it there for a moment. Not as ceremony, just as contact. The way you hold something true when you need to confirm it's still there. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. That night, the story came apart in 2 directions at once. The first direction was the one she had expected. By evening, her name was on every news channel in the country. The passenger who landed the plane. The former Air Force cadet turned software engineer who had walked from seat 17A to the right-hand seat of a commercial aircraft in a mechanical emergency and brought it down on an abandoned military strip in the Cascades. The numbers were everywhere. 81 minutes from engine failure to landing, 2,200 usable feet, 41 feet of clearance from the tree line. The second direction she had not fully anticipated, though she understood it the moment it arrived. A former maintenance engineer named Theodore Greer had spent 14 months trying through official channels to flag the left engine compressor issue on the Pacific Regional Fleet. He had built his file carefully and without anyone's help. Internal memos, inspection reports, the email chain in which the maintenance flag was escalated, the email chain in which it was overridden, the name at the bottom of the override authorization. He spent that evening watching the news coverage. Then he spent 2 hours uploading everything to 3 journalists in 2 aviation safety advocacy organizations. By midnight, the file was in the hands of the Seattle field office of the FAA, the aviation desk of the Associated Press, and a congressional oversight staff member who had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented case. By morning, Frank Sutter was no longer a member of the FAA Safety Review Board, and by morning, Frank Sutter had released a statement. She read it on her phone, sitting in the back of the county sheriff's station in a small town 12 miles from Mackenzie Ridge, where she had been given a cot and a cup of coffee and the temporary mercy of being somewhere the press could not reach. The statement was carefully worded. It acknowledged that the maintenance authorization process would be reviewed. It did not use the word mistake. It did not use the word negligence. And in its third paragraph, it said, while the outcome was fortunate, questions remain. Regarding protocol concerning unauthorized personnel in the flight deck during an emergency situation, bravery is not a substitute for procedure. The investigation will examine all aspects of the incident. She read that paragraph twice. Then she put the phone face down on the cot and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 minutes. He was not going to be simply accountable. He was going to be accountable and fighting simultaneously the way certain people always manage to occupy both positions at once, bending the narrative at the edges to create enough ambiguity that the clean story got complicated. He was going to make the question not only what his signature had risked, but whether her response to the risk had been legitimately authorized. She understood the move. It was what she would have expected from a man whose entire professional identity was built on the authority to evaluate others and find them insufficient. She picked up her phone. She typed a short message to the attorney who had represented her in her Air Force appeal 6 years ago, who had fought that appeal and lost, and told her afterward she had a case worth pursuing through civil channels if she ever wanted to. She had said no at the time because she needed to move away from it, not toward it. She typed, I'm going to need you, not for what you're seeing on the news, for what comes after it. Then she set the phone down and slept for 4 hours. The FAA hearing was held 22 days after the landing. The room was a government conference room in Seattle, large and carpeted and lit with the overhead fluorescence of institutional spaces. Long table for the panel. Chairs in rows for principals and observers. The principals included Avery, her attorney, the airline's legal representation, a union representative for Harmon and Marsh, and Frank Sutter at the far end of the table, in a dark suit with 2 attorneys of his own. Harmon was not present. 7 days out of bypass surgery, his cardiologist had been clear about travel. He had sent a written statement that was entered into the record. Marsh was present. He had recovered fully from the pressure-induced loss of consciousness and sat very straight in his chair with the controlled composure of someone who found it difficult to look at Sutter and was exercising a deliberate discipline not to show it. The hearing proceeded with the methodical pace of official processes, documents entered, timelines established. The full maintenance record examined the chain of authorization laid out in the precise language of regulatory compliance in its absence. Sutter's attorneys made their arguments about process and protocol and the good faith basis for the authorization. They were competent arguments and they were wrong, and the documents made them wrong in ways that no amount of competent argument could fully repair. Then the panel moved to the flight itself. The flight data recorder had been recovered. The cockpit voice recorder had been recovered. Both had functioned throughout the incident. The panel's technical analyst presented the data with the thoroughness that the situation required, which meant he presented all of it. 41 minutes of Avery's decisions reproduced in precise, inarguable numerical terms. The thrust adjustments, the heading corrections, the terrain database query executed in 40 seconds, the approach angle calculation, the gear cycling sequence and its resolution. The crosswind correction held for 11 minutes, the nose-high attitude through the flare, the braking inputs, the deceleration profile, the moment of contact, and the distance to the tree line. Each decision documented, each decision explainable, Each decision examined in retrospect by people with the luxury of stable chairs and the full function of their cardiovascular systems consistent with sound aeronautical judgment under the given constraints. The analyst paused at one point to note that the approach angle Avery had chosen deviated from standard procedure, but was mechanically optimal for the specific configuration of the aircraft at the specific weight and speed and runway length, and that a standard angle approach would have resulted in a landing distance approximately 300 feet longer than what was achieved. 300 feet longer, on a runway with 41 feet to spare. Avery did not look at Sutter during the technical presentation. She looked at the analyst and at the documents and at the panel members asking their questions. She let the room do what it was doing, and she stayed out of its way. Then the panel chair looked at the far end of the table. He said, "Colonel Sutter, you evaluated the candidate now identified to this panel as Avery Lawson during her Air Force Advanced Program candidacy. Your evaluation recommended non-advancement, citing concerns about psychological suitability for high-pressure command scenarios. In light of the data we have just reviewed, do you wish to revise that evaluation for the record?" Sutter sat with his hands flat on the table. He was 60 years old, and he had spent those 60 years being certain of things, and certainty had served him well enough that it had calcified into something he could no longer easily examine from the inside. He looked at the documents on the table, at the numbers the analyst had read, at the 41 feet. One of his attorneys leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Sutter shook his head, a small, tight movement that was not a refusal of legal counsel so much as a recognition that legal counsel was not what was required in this particular moment. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The data speaks for itself." The panel chair waited. "Then is that your complete response?" Sutter said, "Yes." It was not an apology. It was not a retraction. It was 4 words from a man who had built a career on the authority of his own judgment, acknowledging in the only way he was constitutionally capable of acknowledging that his judgment had been wrong without being able to form the sentence that said it plainly. It was the version of accountability available to people who cannot fully access accountability, and Avery understood its limitations precisely and accepted it for what it was. She did not need his apology. She had not needed it for 6 years. What she needed was the record, and the record now had what it needed. After the hearing, she stood in the corridor outside the conference room and let her attorney handle the press questions being posed at the building's entrance. She stood with a cup of water and looked out a window facing west toward the Sound, the water gray and cold in the November afternoon. Colonel Declan Winslow found her there. He was 52, United States Air Force, the kind of career officer whose rank was visible not in his uniform, but in his bearing, the specific posture of someone who has spent decades making decisions that mattered and has learned to carry that weight without letting it show as burden. He had been at the hearing as an observer, which told her something about the level of institutional attention the Air Force was paying to the events of the past 3 weeks. He said the Air Force would like to extend a formal reinstatement offer. Full certification, advanced emergency response, track your choice of posting. The offer comes from the top. She said because of the landing. He said because of everything the landing demonstrated. You have something we cannot teach, Ms. Lawson. We can teach procedure. We can teach systems. We can put trainees under simulated pressure until the procedures become automatic. What you did over the Cascades was not performed under simulated pressure, and that is precisely the distinction that matters. She looked at the water for a moment. She said, "I want 2 things. If the Air Force is serious about this conversation, I want 2 things before we discuss anything else." He said, "Tell me," she said, "first, the evaluation in my file." Sutter's evaluation. "I want it formally expunged from my record, not annotated, not contested with an addendum. Removed. His assessment was not an accurate evaluation of my capability. It was an inaccurate assessment used to justify a predetermined outcome. The record should reflect what the data actually shows." Winslow said, "That will require processing." "But yes, I believe we can do that." She said, "Second, a program named for my father, Raymond Lawson. He flew cargo routes across the Pacific Northwest for 21 years and was never in the Air Force and never had his name in any official record and was the finest pilot I have ever seen, and the reason I can do what I do. I want a flight training initiative, FAA co-sponsored and institutionally backed for candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. For people who have been assessed by someone like Sutter and found lacking for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they can actually fly the Raymond Lawson Flight Initiative, not as a charity attached to my name, as an institutional program with institutional accountability." Winslow was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Your father was a cargo pilot." She said he was, and he was the best pilot I ever saw. Winslow said, I think we can do both of those things. She said, then we can talk about the rest. She did not accept the full reinstatement Winslow had offered. What she accepted after 2 weeks of negotiation was a role that had not previously existed in quite the form it now took. Special instructor in advanced in-flight emergency response, contracted through the Air Force, and co-sponsored by the FAA, working with active pilots and trainees in real aircraft scenarios rather than simulators, teaching not procedure but the space underneath procedure, the place where competence lived when the procedures had run out, and all that remained was judgment in hands and whatever you were made of underneath everything else. She was good at it in the way she had been good at everything she had ever put her full attention into completely and without reservation, and with the specific intensity of a person who understood from direct experience what was at stake when the teaching failed. The letter arrived 6 weeks after the hearing. It came in an envelope with a hand-drawn airplane on the back penciled in with the careful imprecision of someone who was not yet good at drawing airplanes but had tried very hard. The return address was a small town in Kansas she had never heard of. Inside, on lined notebook paper in handwriting that pressed down hard on every capital letter. My name is Nell Grady. I am 12 years old. I live in Salina, Kansas with my mom and my grandmother. I saw you on the news when the thing happened with the plane. My brother told me girls cannot be real pilots. He said you were just lucky and it wasn't real flying. I don't think he's right. I think you flew the plane. I want to do that someday. I want to fly the plane for real. Can you tell me how to start? She read the letter 3 times. The third time she read it, she was sitting at the small desk in the office of the flight academy she had opened outside Seattle 6 weeks into a life that was not the one she had been living before Denver and was not yet fully whatever it was going to be. She thought about a girl who was 12 years old in Salina, Kansas, and had a brother who told her what she couldn't do and who had pressed hard on her capital letters and drawn an airplane on the back of the envelope and sent the letter to a stranger anyway. She wrote back the same day, 2 pages, where to look, what to read, what the path looked like from the beginning and what it would cost and what it would not. The Raymond Lawson Flight Initiative and how to apply. And at the end, your brother is wrong. Not because I say so, because the data says so. When you fly, it will say so again. She sealed the letter and put it in the outgoing mail and sat at the desk for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and thought about her father. He had never seen her fly. He had taught her everything and then left before the teaching bore its full weight. That was the plain fact of it. The icy runway, the brake flagged for service and not serviced. The moment of bad luck that needed no more explanation than that. But the last line he had written, trust the trim, let the plane find its angle, she understood now what she had not understood for 18 years. He had not been writing about the aircraft. He had been writing about her. He had seen what she was becoming with the patient, clear-eyed attention of a man who knew it was coming and could not tell her because telling her would have changed it. So he had written it down on the last morning of his life and left it in the last page of a worn leather book and trusted it to find her when she was ready. It had found her at 41 feet from a tree line in the Cascade Mountains. She pressed the logbook against her side through her jacket pocket and held it there for a moment. Then she let it go and turned off the office light and went home. Tyler Reeves was accepted into the Raymond Lawson Flight Initiative 4 months after the landing. His application had been straightforward in its essentials and extraordinary in its specificity. The personal statement was 2 pages long and described in precise technical detail the moment on Flight 1047 when the aircraft banked and he saw the left wing from his window and recognized from months of self-directed study what the engine configuration beneath that wing meant. He had known something was wrong before the emergency announcement. He had drawn the approach into Mackenzie Ridge from his window view without knowing he was drawing it. The application included the drawing. She reviewed it personally, which was not her standard practice. She recognized in those 2 pages what she had seen in his face when she walked the aisle after the landing. The dry eyes and the focused attention. The stillness that was not calm, but was the thing that came before calm in people who would eventually arrive there. She wrote 1 word in the margin of his file. Yes, his first solo flight was on a Saturday in April 6 months after the landing. The Academy's primary strip was a quiet general aviation field south of Seattle Flat and well-maintained, and the morning was overcast but clear enough for solo operations, and the wind was light from the northwest. She stood at the edge of the tarmac with a cup of coffee and watched him taxi out. He had progressed quickly. Not because he was reckless, but because he was entirely present in the aircraft. No part of him was elsewhere when he flew. He flew with the whole of his attention, the same way he had drawn in his notebook, during the worst 40 minutes of his life, completely engaged with the thing in front of him, because complete engagement was the only mode available to him. His mother would have liked seeing this. She would have driven 2 hours to watch him taxi to the runway, the way certain mothers drive anywhere for anything that makes their children more completely themselves. Avery stood at the edge of the tarmac and watched him go. The Cessna lifted cleanly at the point where the numbers gave way to the gray surface, the nose coming up with the ease of something that has been waiting to do this, the wheels leaving the ground with the particular grace that never stopped being remarkable, no matter how many times she had witnessed it. The aircraft climbed into the overcast in a steady right-hand turn, leveled on the crosswind leg, turned again to downwind, and flew parallel to the field at pattern altitude. Small and certain against the gray April sky. Beside her, Gareth Harmon stood with his hands in his pockets. He was 12 weeks out of bypass surgery. He was not yet cleared to fly and was uncertain whether he would be cleared again. He had reached a kind of peace with that uncertainty that she suspected had cost him considerably, and that she did not ask him about because it was his and not hers to examine. He had driven up from Portland when she called to tell him about Tyler's first solo arriving without requiring any further explanation. They watched Tyler turn base, then final. The approach was clean, standard angle textbook configuration, the angle that worked when everything worked as designed. The Cessna descended toward the numbers with the unhurried confidence of a beginner who has internalized the principles well enough that the principles have become something else closer to instinct, the way all real learning eventually outgrows its own scaffolding. The wheels kissed the runway. Not hard, not rough. Clean contact, main gear first, the nose settling. A moment later, the aircraft, rolling out straight and true down the center line, decelerating with the quiet dignity of a thing that has done what it came to do. Harmon exhaled beside her, not a word, just the sound of breath releasing from somewhere deeper than the lungs. She held the coffee with both hands. In her jacket pocket, the corner of the logbook pressed against her palm. She did not take it out. She held the coffee and let the weight of the book be what it was, and watched Tyler Reeves taxi back toward the ramp with the slow, careful, immensely pleased progress of someone who has just done something for the first time that they will spend the rest of their life doing. Harmon said nothing. She said nothing. The wind came down from the northwest and moved across the field without announcement, without apology, indifferent to what had happened in this valley 6 months ago and completely present in what was happening now. Tyler stepped out of the Cessna at the ramp. The distance was too great to see his face clearly, but she could see the whole of him, the way he stood beside the aircraft with his hand still on the door, and looked at the sky and then at the strip and then across the field at where she was standing. She raised her coffee cup. He raised his hand. She had asked herself in the weeks since the hearing, in the quiet of the new office, and the new mornings and the new version of her life that was still finding its shape, what her father would have made of all of this. Not the headlines or the hearing or the scholarship fund named for him, and those things would have embarrassed him in the straightforward way of a man who valued the doing over the recognition of the doing. But this specific moment, a 17-year-old boy standing beside a Cessna on a gray April morning, hand raised toward the woman who had kept him alive long enough to get here. She thought he would have understood this completely. She thought he might have written it down. The overcast shifted and a narrow band of late morning light came through and lit the wet tarmac in a long, pale stripe from the threshold numbers all the way to the ramp where Tyler stood. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then the clouds closed again and the light was gone. Harmon turned up his collar against the wind. He looked at the strip for a moment longer, then at the sky with the habitual attentiveness of a man who had spent a career reading what weather was doing, and probably always would, even now, even in whatever came next. She finished her coffee. She didn't open the logbook. She had not opened it this morning, and she would not open it now, because she no longer needed to open it to know what it said, the same way she no longer needed to look at the instruments to know the aircraft's attitude. The knowing had moved somewhere deeper than reading. It lived now in the same place that everything her father had taught her lived, below the level of recall, below the level of thought, in the place where training becomes instinct, and instinct becomes the thing you simply are. Trust the trim. Let the plane find its angle. She pressed the logbook against her side through the jacket pocket and stood at the edge of the tarmac with the cold April wind off the Cascades moving through the field around her, and she let the question she would always carry rest in her exactly as it was unanswered and necessary and hers. Her father had never seen her fly, but he had known she would. And somewhere in the weight of a worn leather book and a cracked spine and 3 lines written on the last morning of his life, in the specific angle of a nose-heavy aircraft settling onto a broken runway, 41 feet from a wall of trees, and a 17-year-old boy standing in the early morning light, With his hand raised, the answer to whether that knowing was enough kept arriving quietly without announcement, the way the best things always do. It was enough. It had always been enough.